Hello, friends, and welcome back to the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Jill Sullivan, your host and one of the co-founders of the While We're Waiting ministry. This is a podcast of stories of devastating loss and grief and heartbreak and struggle, and stories of hope and healing and faith and, yes, even joy. Underlying every conversation is the hope we have in Jesus Christ, which makes it possible to not just survive the loss of a child, but to live well while we're waiting to see them again in heaven one day. You can learn more about our ministry and the free bereaved parent retreats we host by visiting our website at www.whilewe'rewaiting.org. Welcome to episode number 204. Today I'm joined by my friends Robert and Linda Hall from Auburn, Alabama. The Halls struggled through 8 years of infertility before they adopted their only son, John, at 4 months of age. John was a remarkable child who loved the Lord and loved people and brought great joy to their lives. When John was a young teen, however, a perfect storm of the traumatic loss of a friend, a prescription for Oxycontin due to a sports injury, and exposure to others' drug use led to years of addiction. Over the next 2 episodes, the Halls share John's story, the struggles of parenting a child through addiction, the experience of losing their only child, grieving with grace as husband and wife, and they tell about the While We're Waiting support group they lead in Alabama. The audio quality is not the best, so you may have to lean in a bit to listen, but I know you'll be blessed by what they have to share. Hi, Robert and Linda. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having us. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. I've been looking forward to our chat. So let's get started by giving you guys an opportunity just to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself. Tell us where you're from and what life is like for you there.
Okay. Well, we're from a small town in South Alabama, but right now we're living in the Auburn, Alabama area. We just celebrated our 47th anniversary a couple of weeks ago. And during that time, we've lived in 7 states, but most of that time has been in Birmingham, Alabama.
Like Linda said, we grew up in Eufaula and Phoenix City, Alabama. I did. And then we moved around some, especially before John. We like to travel, and we moved to a lot of different places. But I guess we wound up in Auburn, which is we never thought we would do because we're Alabama fans. So we say we're on mission work. So that's our excuse.
That's right. That's a big deal in Alabama, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Robert retired from a career in IT. My degree is teaching elementary, but I didn't really teach for very long, but I've done a lot of volunteer work and been on staff in churches with women's ministry. And now we're retired, and Robert's enjoying that, and I do a lot of work through our church with continuing with women's ministry, but with international women, teaching them English and the Bible, and it's a real blessing to be able to do that.
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know you did that. Very good. All right, so we're here today to talk about your son, John. Take a few minutes and tell us about him. Help us get to know John a little bit.
Well, as all of our children are, John was God's very special gift to us. We experienced 8 years of infertility, and we ended up adopting him when he was 4 months and 9 days old. Just John's story, adoption story in itself is such a story of God's sovereignty. The first time we had the opportunity to say yes to adopt him, there were a few little uncertain circumstances around his birth parents regarding their rights and that sort of thing. So we actually said no. But God had a plan, and it just took us a few months to see it. We both now, I would say, firmly believe that John was born to be in our family, that it was God's plan that he would be our son. And he grew up hearing about Jesus and God's word from just as soon as he was with us. And that continued throughout his life. The Lord was drawing John to himself at a very early age. He grew up hearing the gospel in our home on a regular basis. And one Saturday morning, he woke up. He was old, Jill. And he told us that he had asked Jesus to save him the night before after we tucked him in, and which just really blew us away. I mean, he was 3 years old, and what little 3-year-old is thinking about Jesus after his parents tuck him in? But we talked to him. We were just really amazed at his understanding of how God has made a way for us to know him as sinful people, and we really didn't know what to do, so we just continued to just foster that, and he ended up being baptized at his request when he was 6, and he was baptized on an Easter Sunday. But when he was in middle school, which I think happens to a lot of kids that make a profession of faith at a very young age, he was uncertain because he didn't have a good memory of those early days. And so at summer camp, that summer, church camp, he made a profession of faith and wanted to be baptized again. And so obviously we happy to do that, because whatever it takes for him to have confidence and walk in assurance of his salvation. But what he was like, he was such a joy, obviously, to both of us. And we were best little buddies, he and I, and Robert and him. They just shared a love of sports. Baseball, it started out as, but eventually football took over. And as Robert already said, especially Alabama football. John was tenderhearted. He just really loved people. He loved people more than he loved his stuff. I can really say that. He especially loved us. He was the one in the room that was always watching and listening and kind of taking it all in. And I could just tell you so many things about the way he helped people, served people, when he didn't even really know that he was doing that, but we saw that in him. That we loved to laugh. He loved to laugh. We'd get tickled and just be crying because we were so tickled. But just so many things I could tell you about him. Just probably too many things to tell you for the time that we have. One memory I do have is that at Christmas time, he was 3 or 4 years old, and my mom and dad gave him a big red fire truck. And as he was opening that, he saw what it was, and he stopped, and he looked up at Mama and Papa and said, "Oh, you shouldn't have." And it's just that's just him. He was just so just kind-hearted, very kind-hearted and tender-hearted.
And there was one story that has encouraged me for a long time. He was in the 10th grade, and he was beginning to have problems. He had been having problems for about a year, but he was at Auburn High School, and I got an email from his English teacher. And at that time, if I got an teacher, but he just said, "I just want to tell you about your son." And I'll probably cry. But
that's all right.
But he said there was a kid in his class, his English class, a special needs kid. He was the only special needs kid in the class. And he said his mother died. And we didn't know it. But John skipped school and went to the funeral with the teacher.
Wow.
The teacher saw him there. And the teacher was sitting behind him. And he said, "I just want you to know that the little boy asked John if he thought his mother was in heaven." And he said he went through the most beautiful rendition of the gospel I've ever heard. And he said he just hugged that little boy and stayed till the end, and then he left. And he said, I really don't even think he knew him personally. He just knew that he needed somebody. But he said he presented the gospel, told him that what it was like to be in heaven, and he said he was just amazed. He said at the heart, he said it showed so much heart. And because John's problem started when he was about 12 years old. And he had a really traumatic experience. His church buddy and school buddy was his daddy owned a car dealership. And 2 men who dressed as policemen went and kidnapped the dad and John's friend, and took him out and killed John's friend and tried to kill the dad and buried them both, but the dad wasn't dead. And so he dug his way out and they caught him. But John had a night with them a few days before, and so he could have been there. And that was when it started. John asking questions about why God would let that happen to a good kid. Why? She said, Brett went to church. He said he did the right things. He said, how could this happen? And John was a thinker. He's a very sensitive kid, but he was a thinker. And that's when it all really started. And then he got hurt wrestling, and he had a shoulder operation, and they put him on Oxycontin, and he found relief in it, but because he always had bad dreams, and that's where it all started.
So he got hooked on the Oxycontin, and that led to more.
I think the Oxycontin gave him relief. And so then he started, I think, we made a mistake with John. I made a mistake with John when John was in the 8th grade. John's high school football coach asked me if John could play on the varsity. They didn't have any 8th graders on the varsity. And I think my pride got into it. Yeah, I said, this is good. He said, look, I'll take care of him. He said, but we could use him. And so the part I didn't think about was John traveling with 12th graders. 11th graders, and him being 8 years old. 8th grade. So he was exposed to things then, and I think he was exposed to alcohol. He was exposed to marijuana, and that, in conjunction with his friend dying, it all came together at the same time. So it's hard to say, well, this is where it started, but that's the time frame of it.
Sounds like it was kind of a perfect storm.
It was a perfect storm.
Yeah, very soon after John's friend was kidnapped and murdered, we started really seeing, as Robert says, changes in him. His grades started dropping. He was a good student. I mean, not an A student, but he was a good student. But he just began to really kind of lose interest, maybe even in life itself. It's hard to really say looking back on it, but his grades suffered. He lost interest in sports. He lost interest in church. And we started seeing some anger issues. We had such a hard time knowing how to help him. When that happened, the school called in counselors, and they did all that they need to help. And it just wasn't helping John. John actually was in counseling in some form on and off for the rest of his life. Many of those, not many, but several of those counselors did tell us that, that they were just at a loss. They didn't know how to help him. And they would say, we don't think we're helping him, because he just refused to talk about his feelings. And he emphatically refused to talk about his friend's death. When we realized that John had started drinking and smoking marijuana, of course, that scared us to death, because both of his birth parents had addiction. And John knew that, because when he got to a certain age, we had those conversations, and we were very open about his adoption. But everything that we were doing, anything that we were doing, was just very difficult. It didn't work. It didn't work. And we just felt hopeless and helpless. And that's kind of where we found ourselves. As the anger issues started to increase. And to fast forward a little bit, by the age of 18, John went to his first drug rehab program. He went to several more over the next 8 years. And he would always do really well while he was in rehab. And honestly, those were the times that we had rest and peace, because we knew he was safe when he was in a rehab program. But when he would get out, he would relapse, because it's just so difficult. But while he was in, he would get, back to himself, is what I like to say, back to himself, because, obviously anyone who has dealt with someone who is addicted, it completely changes your personality and who you are. But when he would get clean, he would just, he would always say, just how sorry he was for everything. And, that was not who he wanted to be. But it's just so difficult to get on the other side of addiction.
So he battled that for a long time, it sounds like.
Yes.
10 years.
Yeah.
Loving, really.
10 years.
Maybe even more than that.
Yeah,
if we
it could have
really
been.
got to count it. When John was 25, he wasn't living at home. I mean, anyone who might be listening has dealt with a child that has a problem with addiction. You know that you have to make hard decisions, really hard decisions. And John was not at home. He actually was not even living in the same state as us. And we got a call one morning from one of his friends, and she told us that she had taken John to the hospital because of his erratic and dangerous behavior the night before. She was very fearful that he was going to hurt himself, just things he was doing. And so the hospital, when they got there, they admitted him to the psychiatric ward. Of course, we took off from work and just got there as fast as we could. John stayed in the hospital for 7 days, and we knew that he desperately needed help, and I'm sure he knew that as well, but we just didn't know what to do. It's difficult parenting a child that struggles with, emotional trauma, addiction, and who is an adult also. That puts another kind of level to that. You feel helpless, as I said, hopeless. But while he was in the hospital, we could only visit him twice a day, and the visits were very short. So when we weren't with him, Robert and I basically walked the streets and just begged God to show us what to do. And Robert was searching on the internet for a rehab that we had not already been to, that we knew about, and that would have a strong biblical influence, because we knew that John's only hope was ultimately the Lord. And on one of those internet searches, a recovery program that we'd never seen before popped up, and the tagline was "Worshiping Our Way Out of Addiction," and it was just for men. And we really felt that the Lord had heard and answered our prayer. We called them and, went through the process, and they accepted John, and we had to, of course, convince John to go, because he never wanted to go to rehab, but he finally agreed to go, and we were just so very thankful, because once again, he would be safe. He did well in that program, and we began to see and hear in our phone conversations with him spiritual openness, and eventually, over time, spiritual growth, because the program was basically an intensive discipleship program approaching addiction through the lens of Scripture, and what does it really mean to follow Christ. And John, he returned to the Lord. I actually have a voicemail from him, and I'm so glad that I didn't answer my phone that night. He'd called one night after we'd gone to bed, and in his message, he thanked us for sending him there, and he was emotional, and he just tells us again just how very sorry he was for all that he put us through, but yet, we're watching him go through this, and it's just heart-wrenching to watch that. And when John was in other rehabs, he would, in his right self, he would ask us, he would always, I don't know if he asked Robert or not, but he would ask me, he said, "Mom, do you think I'm really saved?" And, it just played on his mind. I mean, looking back on that, I think a person normally is not concerned with their salvation unless they are really saved, if you know what I mean by that.
Sure.
Most people who are not salvation, but we had always told him that, just reminding him of those days in his profession of faith, but that we told him that he had to talk to God about that and, settle it with him. But back in that message, he told us on that night that he knew he was saved and that he would go to heaven when he died. And I just can't tell you how thankful I am that I never deleted that message, and that I still have it even today.
Yes.
And I listen to it from time to time. So when John left that program, he decided to stay in the area because he had a good support system there, and he was able to still continue meeting with the men he had met who lived in the area. And we agreed that that would be a good thing. There was a family there that helped him, and just so many wonderful people that helped us by helping John. But he seemed to be doing well. He had a job. He had a place to live. He was going to church most Sundays, and he was meeting with a wonderful counselor that he had found in the area. We'll always be so grateful for her. But about 4 or 5 months, I think it was, Robert, would you say, out of the program, we began to suspect that John had relapsed again. But we just continued to encourage him. We were really far away, many miles, many states away. And once again, we found ourselves in that place of feeling helpless. John's birthday is January 8th. And at this point now, John is 26. And so this would have been his 27th birthday. And we had planned to fly up to see him on his birthday because he had told us that he had to work, so he didn't go for the holidays. Robert had talked to John on Friday night before his birthday, which would be January 6th, and they made a plan for our visit, and we were scheduled to fly up on Sunday morning, January 8th, which was his birthday, and spend a couple of days with him. But unfortunately, that did not happen. On Saturday morning around 8:25, we received a phone call, and we were told over the phone that John's roommate had found him unresponsive earlier that morning around 6. Of course, he called 911, but it was too late. John was already gone. At first, the authorities weren't exactly sure what had taken John's life. They were suspicious, of drugs, especially with his background, but there was no evidence of drug use apartment, and there weren't enough drugs in his system to be classified as an overdose. So they opened an investigation. And after several months, it took, I think, really about 3 or maybe it was actually 5 months, they told us that John had bought and used drugs late Friday night that had been laced with carfentanil. We hear a lot on the news about fentanyl, but this is a little bit different. It's much stronger. And carfentanil was the cause of his death. We'd never even heard of carfentanil. And what it basically is a synthetic opioid that's used to tranquilize elephants and other large animals. It's 10,000 times more potent than morphine and 50 times more potent than heroin. So once again, we were begging the Lord to help us, but this time it wasn't for John's recovery, but it was to walk through the pain of losing him.
But it's been 7 years, 4 months, and the Lord had really been faithful in sustaining us, and just in different ways. Of course, when all this started, we prayed faithfully for John to be healed. And it took a while to understand that he was completely healed, but just not in our time. He was healed in God's time, in God's way. And once you can come to that point, there's such a burden relief. You can have a sense of peace. You still have hurt, but you can reach a point that you have peace that I wouldn't ask him to come back if I could, because I know he's with the Lord.
Yeah, that's so hard, but so true, that you have to come to that place where you can realize that he is truly healed. In the same way, our situation is different, and our daughter had cancer, but we were praying for her earthly healing, just like you were praying for John's healing. And our kids were healed in a way that is not what we were praying for, but they are completely and thoroughly and eternally healed. And that is something to be grateful for, but that doesn't make us miss them any less, does it?
No,
it does not.
I had an experience, I guess, 3 or 4 months ago, and we all have different experiences at different times. I'll go for days and be good, but then I'll have a bad day. But we were in church and we were singing. I forget the song we were singing, and it came to my mind. This is one of John's favorite songs. I wish he was here to hear it. And it was almost like it was verbal, where God said, why would you wish for something for John that's not as good as what I've given him? Would you wish for him to be back? Would you listen to this song or with me? And it just gave me peace. It really just gave me peace. And I hadn't forgot it. I think in our hardest times, we need to remember that our children are in the presence of God. And as much as we love them, they wouldn't come back either. It's just, you come to a place, but it's only through the hope of Christ that you can have that peace. It comes from nowhere else. It just doesn't.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. So John was your only child. And I imagine that makes your experience very different from somebody who has surviving children. Talk about that experience of losing your only child.
Well, the obvious thing is there are a lot of things that we won't get to experience because we don't have another child. But then, of course, I think of parents who won't get it. None of us will get to experience certain things with any of our children who have left us behind. But, we didn't get to see John get married, become a dad, and we just feel so strongly he'd have been a great husband and father. Mm-hmm. No grandchildren. We don't get to make new memories with him, and we don't have other children to kind of invest in. In some ways, we have felt that we've lost a purpose, one of our greatest purposes in life. But the Lord is not finished with us, or else we wouldn't be here. But it's tempting to compare your life with others who are your age, to see what they have and that we don't. But God has been so faithful to give us ministry opportunities and that other people our age don't have because they don't have time for it. Robert and I were actually talking just last week about how we are completely free to serve any way that the Lord wants us to, and that would be our desire. But the Lord has given us so many young adults just through ministry that we have opportunity to invest in them, and they're just so good to us. We have a lot of young friends. We had a couple this past weekend, where we could be their parents and then some, but they come and see us and spend time with us, and we're just so grateful that the Lord has given us so many young adults to still invest in, and that's a blessing to us.
Yeah, that is a blessing indeed, and I know that you're a blessing to them as well.
Mm-hmm. We try to be.
Mm-hmm.
You try to find purpose.
Yeah. So it's been a little over 7 years, like you said, since John went to heaven. How would you say that your grief has kind of evolved through the years?
It definitely does evolve. And I think that's so important to know when you're early in the journey. It will not always be the way it is today. And not only have I'll just say for myself, and Robert may feel the same way, but not only have I had to grieve John's death, but I've had to grieve a lot of things about his life. He had unresolved issues, emotional issues. Of course, he struggled with addiction, and he lost a lot of things in life because of that. And so though that's been a part of my grief, is just kind of, those things that you say, I wish we'd done something differently, or I wish we had not done that, or what if we had done, just all of those things. And I know that all parents have some questions like that, but it was for his life. It was for the living, not just in his death. And so there's a lot of things to deal with. We have dear friends who came alongside of us early on. They lost their son in 1993, so it's been 31 years for them. And they told us that it would get better. Of course, it was hard to believe in those early days. But as I said, it does evolve. It does get better, but it takes time. We have to remember, I hear this little saying a lot that, it's not a marathon. I mean, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And that's so true. It's just not gonna, you get weary. You get so tired of being sad, so tired of all of those thoughts you have to process, and it just takes time. And I think it's important to know that, and to take that time.
Linda and I have grieved differently. I've thought about this a lot. I probably started grieving John's death 2 or 3 years before he died, because we've been going through the addiction process for 10, 11 years. And I knew in my heart, and I believe sincerely, that John was a Christian. And John was suffering. And I was praying that the Lord would resolve the suffering in his way, in his time. But I wanted John to stop hurting. So I think at that point, when I started praying that prayer, I started grieving John's death. Not intentionally, but looking back on it, I did. Because looking at it from an eternal perspective, I was praying for the day that John would be in heaven. Because I knew he wouldn't hurt anymore. He wouldn't be afraid anymore. So I just started that grieving process then. And a lot because of my background, before I met Linda, I could be a hermit, and I can live in isolation very well. Linda cannot. She is totally different. So when I'm processing this, I need to be by myself and let me process it. I don't need to talk through it in order to come to a resolution. Linda's different. She needs to talk through it. She wants to talk about it. And at times, she wanted to talk about it a little too much for me. But the pain was there. The pain is still there. And it hurts tremendously. But I truly believe he's with Christ. And so I take great satisfaction and peace from that. And I don't want this to sound bad because everybody's different. But I don't walk around creating the day because I know where John's at and I know what he's doing. And all I ever wanted for him was to know the Lord, be happy, and be safe. And so all those prayers have been answered. I don't have anything to be sad about today except my own feelings
Of missing him.
of missing him. I don't have anything to be sad about for John.
Yeah.
And so I was able to put it down, grieve him every day, but I rejoice every day when I think about where he's at. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And I understand that. And you acknowledge that you guys both grieve very differently. So how have you worked through that? We've got the hermit and then we've got the verbal processor. How have you guys made that work?
Well, since it's been that way for 47 years on other things,
Right.
we were
wasn't
used to
new.
working
Yeah.
with it. Yeah, it wasn't new.
Sure.
Yeah. Robert had said that he began grieving John's death really before he died. And of course, I know how dangerous drugs can be. But I really believed that God was going to heal John in his life. I really did. But after his death, the Lord was so gracious to me to let me see fairly soon that God had completely healed him in heaven, as Robert said. I think practically, as far as grieving, as a couple, like we've already said, we both grieve differently. We need to give each other space and grace and be patient. One thing I would say that, if, like, to a listener, if your child is the death of your child has caused marital problems, to recognize that and admit it early and ask for help. And the sooner the better. I would say, don't be too proud or too angry or too apathetic to seek help because your marriage is so important. You need each other. And this is something that I always, think about. Is the only other person in the world who knew John like I did. And when we are able to talk about him, his memories become my new memories of John, if that makes sense. And you will get to a point where you can remember your child together if it's too hard to do that today.
That's good. I appreciate that. This concludes the first half of my conversation with Robert and Linda Hall. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to sharing the rest of our chat with you next Wednesday.